The idea of introducing a wealth tax in Canada for the richest individuals in our country has been gaining steam recently, and it seems a lot of Canadians like this concept. But is it actually a good idea? Today's guest is Philip Cross. He is the former Chief Economic Analyst for Stats Canada and a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. He's the author of a new report called Does Canada Need a Wealth Tax? And you can find that at fraserinstitute.org. Philip, thank you so much for being with us today. He joins us via Skype from Ottawa.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Now, Philip, can you first of all explain exactly what a wealth tax is, how it works, and who it would apply to?
Sure. A wealth tax isn't that esoteric an idea. It works a lot like a property tax, and I think most people know how a property tax works. The city comes along, it evaluates your property to be worth a certain amount of money, and then it's taxed at a rate of 2 or 3%. The only difference between a property tax and a wealth tax is a wealth tax should deduct out your liabilities. So, for example, instead of just taxing the value of your home, it would be the net value of your value less your mortgage. But a wealth tax basically works along the same principles.
But it would apply to certain individuals making a certain income, right?
It it most likely would. I mean, I think the idea is to shift the tax burden to wealthier people. So that also makes it different from a property tax. Almost all property owners pay a property tax, but a wealth tax, at least the way it's being proposed in the United States by people such as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and up here by the NDP in Canada, it's meant to be targeted people earning, say $400,000 or more.
I see. Okay, so why are so many Canadians in favor of a wealth tax? Is it because the idea that a large gap in wealth inequality is a bad thing?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure. I haven't seen, when I was doing the research for this paper, I didn't see any evidence of, X% of Canadians were in favor of a wealth tax. I did notice that the NDP, who are the one party that advocated, didn't do very well in the last election. So, and similarly, we saw that Sanders and Warren in the United States lost the Democratic nomination, of course, to Joe Biden. So, those people who have proposed a wealth tax actually haven't done well with the electorate. So I'm not sure how widespread the idea is, but you can sort of see the idea, the appeal of the idea is that, in a time when we're running such massive government deficits, of course, we're starting to look for who's going to pay for this. And the reflexive idea is always, well, let's just pass this burden on to a small number of wealthy people or a small number of corporations, and we, the vast majority of ordinary Canadians, will not bear the burden. And of course, it doesn't work out that way in real life. We know that when we hit the fiscal wall in the mid 90s, for example, it was the average Canadian who bore the brunt of tax increases. Quebec, for example, is very well known for its social democratic leanings. And yet, when they faced a deficit coming out of the 08, 09 recession, they increased four taxes that affected the ordinary person. The sales tax went up 2 percentage points, the health care premium went up, tuition fees went up, and the tax on gasoline went up. So that's typically when governments need large quantities of money, frankly, they have to tax wide swaths of the population. The idea that we can get a small group of people to bear a large amount of the fiscal burden never works out. But initially, as I say, it's always people's reflexive solution when they're faced with a big fiscal challenge.
Okay, so how much of a wealth gap is there in Canada, and is it currently growing or is it shrinking?
Well, the wealth gap in Canada is much less marked than in the United States. The same is also true of income. And of course, wealth is really just, in some sense, income built up over time. You can have a high income for 1 year and not be very wealthy. But if you have a high income for several years, eventually you'll break into the top X%. What's interesting is Statistics Canada just started collecting wealth data after the 08, 09 recession when interest in wealth became much more widespread. And I was there at the time when we started this wealth survey. And what it shows is that over the last decade, the concentration of wealth amongst the richest Canadians has actually declined. So we're actually going in the opposite direction for the US. But as I say, I often find that we import a lot of these narratives directly from the US without correcting them for the facts on the ground here in Canada. And I think the idea of a wealth tax is another good example of that.
What are some of the cons of a wealth tax? I understand that it might be quite complicated and costly to administer.
It's costly to administer. It doesn't raise a lot of money. We have a lot of experience with European countries, and they haven't been able to raise a lot of money. The net revenues are further reduced by it's very complicated to administer. And it really doesn't do much to change inequality either. So it hasn't proven, even if you're worried about inequality, and as I say, it's been falling in Canada, but even then, if you thought inequality was something that needs to be corrected, a wealth tax is probably not the way to go. It has proven to be not a very effective tool.
Now, Philip, you write that a wealth tax would constrain economic growth. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, basically the idea is that a wealth tax would encourage consumption. It actually penalizes savings. If I had recently signed a big contract with the Vancouver Canucks, for example, for a couple $1 million, if I go out and spend all that money on travel around the world and whining and dining with my friends, that's okay. But if I save that money and reinvest it in a corporation, that would be penalized. So a wealth tax actually penalizes the very behavior that we know is best for an economy in the long term, which is saving and investment. And it rewards people who engage in frivolous consumption. So we really get all our economic incentives backwards with a wealth tax. So I think in the simplest terms, that's why it isn't good for economic growth in the long term. It's like low interest rates. It rewards people going into debt and penalize people who save. And we know in the long run, that's the exact opposite of the incentives we want to.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at that for sure. What can we learn from other nations who have implemented wealth taxes over the years?
Well, we do have a large number of European nations whose experience we can draw on. Starting in the mid 1980s, 14 European nations introduced a wealth tax of various forms and various severity. It's very instructive that 10 of them have given up. They just found it. In the case of Germany, the courts ruled it unconstitutional. In the case of France, they found that wealthy people were leaving the country. In Denmark found it was just too complicated to administer. So I think it's very instructive that most European countries gave up on trying to implement it, and those who have retained it have maintained very low tax rates. They define a very narrow base to which it's applied. It seems to be, frankly, largely token that they're keeping it even on the books. It doesn't raise significant revenues, less than 1% of GDP. It doesn't do much to change inequality. So it seems to be sort of like our carbon tax here in Canada. We slap a $20 carbon tax. We say, yippee, we've done something for the environment. And then we just jump in our cars and drive off to work as usual. It smacks of tokenism.
Now, Philip, is there any evidence that a wealth tax will actually cause wealthy individuals to move their business interests to other countries?
Yes, France in particular is very instructive in that regard. The French, when they abandoned their wealth tax, that was the number one reason they did it, was they found people were moving to other countries. The best example is Gerard Depardieu. I might be mispronouncing that, but the most famous actor in France, he very famously, in response to a wealth tax, just moved across the border to Belgium. So he was the most high profile case. But we've seen this in other countries. There's a lot of evidence in the US, for example, that if you slap an estate tax, which is a tax on wealth of people when they die, that people will move from states that have a wealth tax or an estate tax to states that don't have one, and almost nobody moves back in the other direction. So there seems to be a lot of evidence that actually that people vote with their feet and they do move to avoid a wealth tax.
Now, how do business people typically view a wealth tax? Does it remove incentive to earn more income?
In the long run, yes, but it's much more of a concern that it removes the incentive to save and invest. And partly as a result, And most people, by the way, are, don't want, everybody holds various forms of wealth. Most Canadians hold wealth, but it's usually in the form of housing and pension savings. So the first thing that most politicians do is they say, well, of course, housing and pension savings are going to be exempt. Well, when you do that, 70% of wealth is exempt, and you end up applying a wealth tax to a very small number of assets, such as small businesses, or investment funds and so on. So it tends not to, in practice, to not affect very many assets, and that's part of the problem. It ends up not being a very large tax and rather inconsequential in its effect.
Now, can this affect average Canadians in the fact of like, let's say a business wants to create fewer jobs because of, trying to avoid the wealth tax, right? Could this impact average Canadian workers?
Oh, it certainly could. In particular, I'd be quite concerned about its rate of a business formation. We're coming through a very severe crisis now. We know the number of businesses going bankrupt is rising and likely to rise quite sharply this fall and winter. We're going to need young people, especially, to come along and found new businesses to take the place. And new businesses in particular, they'll have a lot of debt when they're starting out. So unless you allow for that and correct for that, you can end up creating a lot of liquidity problems for new startups. They're suddenly going to be faced with a new tax on their assets. And for a lot of new firms starting out, this can, really stop them from growing. So, especially at this moment of history, when we want to encourage businesses to continue and new firms to start up, a wealth tax actually sends the exact opposite signal to investors.
Interesting. Now, are there some pros to a wealth tax? There have been a number of billionaires who say they actually support higher taxes for the extreme rich.
Yeah. Well, and yes, and I think those people should feel free. I mean, Warren Buffett is the most obvious example. He's spoken about how he should pay more taxes. I never understood, why doesn't Warren Buffett just write a check to the government of the United States and any other millionaires, billionaires out there who feel they have too much money, and if they can't find my address, then they can, send their money to the government of Canada. I'm sure they'll be happy to cash a check. The problem is that the fact that, certain individuals, a lot of the heirs of the Disney family, for example, signed this petition. Well, if you feel guilty about the money you inherited and you don't feel that you've earned it, as I say, feel free to send money to the government, but you are not free to impose those same views on other people who don't share them. And this comes back down to, a fundamental matter of liberty and freedom in our society. The other thing is, as an economist, I would say it's much more efficient to tax the income, the capital income that wealth generates. We want to encourage people to invest. Let people invest. Then, when they make money on their capital gains or they pay out dividends, tax those forms of income. That's a much more efficient way. That's not going to deter the original investments in wealth creation, and yet it will uh, lay a tax on that capital income. So there are, economists would argue, there are much more efficient and ways of taxing capital income without the distorting effects on savings and investment that come from a wealth tax.
Now, Philip, with the younger generation increasingly demanding some kind of a wealth tax for the rich in order to close that wealth gap, would you care to venture a guess as to whether or not we will see a wealth tax in Canada within the next decade or two?
I'd be surprised. I mean, I think if we to do so, we would have to close our eyes to all the evidence that's been coming from Europe and other countries that this just hasn't proved to be a very good solution. There are other ways of, if you are worried about inequality, and as I say, in Canada, inequality is declining, and yet we continue to import this narrative from the US that inequality is increasing. But even if we do believe in this false narrative, there are more effective ways of dealing with it. As I say, there are ways of taxing income and especially capital income that don't have any of the really negative consequences of a wealth tax that have made it such an ineffective tool. So, I really think, I hope that wiser heads will prevail and we'll learn from the experience of other countries and we'll adopt better, more effective ways of dealing with these problems.
And with that, Philip, it looks like we are about out of time. So thanks so much, Philip, for being here with us today. Philip Cross, author of a new report, Does Canada Need a Wealth Tax? That is available at FraserInstitute.org. Thanks so much, Philip.
Thank you. My pleasure.